There are stories in the Bible that hit you like a punch in the gut. But then there are others that, besides that punch, leave you with a question constantly nagging at you. How did these people not see what was right in front of them? The story of Amos is one of those. A simple man with no title, no fame, no microphone, yet with such a powerful message that it made kings tremble and religious people squirm. And the most shocking part? No one listened. No one. Maybe it's easier to ignore the truth than to change the comfort of our daily lives. After all, who wants to give up status, privileges, or the appearance of holiness when everything seems fine? But the truth is, behind Israel's prosperity, there was injustice, corruption, and a fake faith. And Amos was the last warning before everything fell apart. What about today? Are we not living in the same blindness, only now we have modern clothes and rehearsed smiles? This video isn't for those looking for more pretty content. It's for those ready to be challenged. Here you'll understand how God raises up unlikely people to speak truths that almost no one wants to hear. You'll see why Amos's words still resonate today, and why hypocrisy disguised as spirituality remains the most dangerous poison in our generation. Get ready, because if you listen until the end, your life could be turned upside down in the best way. The question is, will you ignore it like they did with Amos? Or will you be one of the few who truly pay attention? Amos wasn't someone who frequented palaces or had an advanced theological education. He was a shepherd and a fig tree farmer, a common tree among the poor. He spent his days in the fields, under the scorching sun of Judah, with calloused hands and cracked feet from the dry earth. Tekoa, his hometown, wasn't one of the big cities. It was a forgotten village, tiny on the map, but huge in God's eyes. And that teaches us something essential. It's not where you come from, but where God sends you that changes the course of history. Amos's greatness was precisely in his simplicity. Some people wait to be ready enough to accept a calling. They wait for a diploma, a platform, a microphone with a logo. Amos didn't wait for applause to obey. He had no followers, no prestige, but he had a heart aligned with justice. And sometimes all God needs is exactly that, someone who won't negotiate what's right. Living among cattle and fig trees teaches you to see the world with clear eyes, no filters, no vanity. Maybe that's why God loves to start revolutions through the anonymous. Amos's origin wasn't a barrier, it was purpose. He came from the mud, so he understood those still stuck in it. He didn't speak from theory, but from experience. He was like someone who's gone hungry explaining to another the value of the last piece of bread. This connection between experience and mission gave him an authority that didn't come from titles, but from truth, the kind that touches the soul. And let's be honest, nowadays there's a lot missing from the speeches of those who have the spotlight. What does this teach us in practice? That you don't need to wait for the perfect moment to live with purpose. Out of resources. Amos was too. Out of the spotlight. Even better, it's in the absence of the audience that sincerity is born. Want something concrete? Start by impacting the environment where you already are. Use your voice to denounce injustices in your street, your community, your circle. Don't wait for an invitation to stand up. Heaven doesn't call influencers, it sends intercessors. What's most impressive about Amos is that he wasn't trained to be heard. He spoke because he couldn't stay silent anymore. It was like someone seeing an open wound and, even without being a doctor, trying to stop the bleeding. Amos had that instinct. He didn't ask for permission to feel the weight of injustices, he just carried it. And believe this, those who carry the burdens of the people with sincerity hear God's whisper more clearly. It's a path without spotlight, but full of power. Today, many are drawn to those who speak beautifully, but ignore those who live what they preach. Amos didn't master the art of podium speeches, but he exuded the coherence of life. He was like that neighbor no one notices until the day he speaks and everyone listens. He didn't use fancy words, but he spoke truths that cut like a razor. Because he didn't speak to impress, he spoke to transform, and transformation demands confrontation. No one repents after hearing sweetened words. It's the bitterness of truth that provokes real change. Maybe you know someone like this, or maybe you are that person. Someone who's felt the effects of unjust systems, who's had to swallow hard many times. Know this: that pain can become the seed of purpose if you allow it. That's how it was with Amos. He wasn't refined in a school but forged in adversity. And the most curious thing, suffering, when carried with dignity, refines our sensitivity to what really matters. So, never underestimate the lessons from scarcity. And it was with this history of anonymity and resistance that Amos was called to a mission many would have turned down. He didn't offer himself, nor did he chase after it. But he accepted. He accepted because he understood that there are moments when staying silent is worse than being wrong. And it's precisely when heaven starts weighing on the inside that we begin to disturb those too comfortable on the outside. This discomfort grows, because God's call isn't an invitation to the audience, it's a command to the prophet. The calling that came to Amos wasn't the kind that arrives with letterhead or trumpets from heaven. It came like a weight on his soul, an unease he couldn't explain, but also couldn't ignore. It was like a pain that wasn't his, but that hurt inside of him, something between discomfort and purpose. And this is something many people still don't understand today. God's calling rarely comes wrapped in comfort. It shakes, shifts, and challenges. Amos didn't want to be a prophet, but he couldn't live like he used to either. When God calls, he tends to interrupt. He interrupts routines, unravels plans, and uninstalls you from your comfort zone. And it was no different with Amos. He was in the field, tending to wild fig trees and sheep, when suddenly he found himself overwhelmed by words that burned inside him. Words that weren't his, but that wouldn't let him rest until they were spoken. This kind of silent urgency reveals a true calling. If you've ever felt the urge to shout against an injustice, you might have already heard that breath from on high. The interesting thing is, Amos didn't start by speaking about Israel. He began his mission denouncing the neighboring nations. It was as if God, through him, was surrounding the territory. While the people cheered the condemnation of others, Amos moved closer to the central point, Israel itself. This teaches us something precious. Not every mission begins the way we imagine. Sometimes the real purpose only reveals itself after the first act of obedience, and obeying that first step is a task for the brave. Amos didn't seek validation from anyone. He didn't wait for approval from religious leaders, nor did he worry about shaping his message to avoid offending the target audience. He was like an arrow shot without return, and that's rare today. Some people are waiting for likes to speak the truth, but those sent by God don't measure their words by applause, they measure them by faithfulness. And faithfulness often means being misunderstood by everyone except God. Maybe you're waiting for a bright sign in the sky, an audible voice or confirmation from someone influential. But what if the calling is already inside you, just waiting for you to stop running? Amos didn't have an elaborate send-off. He had a willing heart, and that was enough. The question isn't whether God is speaking. It's whether you're ready to listen, even when what he says is unsettling. Remember, obedience doesn't always come with applause, but it always comes with purpose. If you've ever felt that something needs to change around you, if you found yourself overwhelmed by indignation in the face of injustice or hypocrisy, you might be closer to Amos than you think. Because the calling begins as discomfort, and from that discomfort the movement is born. It's no coincidence that so many transformative leaders began as the nuisances of their groups. They didn't fit the mold, and that's why God used them to break the mold, just like he did with that shepherd. Amos's calling also teaches us how to deal with fear, because make no mistake, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the commitment to what's right, despite it. Amos knew that confronting Israel's elite was dangerous, but he chose to displease men rather than disobey heaven. That's rare. Many people stay silent for convenience. Amos broke the silence out of conviction, and those who act out of conviction, even alone, are never without support. And so the shepherd from Tekoa became the spokesperson of the kingdom. No ceremony, no stage, no blessing from the leaders. Only the weight of a God who refuses to tolerate silence in the face of injustice. And this journey, which began with words burning in his chest, now moves into a new phase. The direct confrontation with a society that seemed healthy on the outside, but was rotting on the inside. What Amos found when he arrived in Samaria wasn't misery or chaos. It was ostentation, comfort, and the appearance of progress. Ivory-clad houses, lavish banquets, refined music, and endless parties. At first glance, everything seemed stable, but behind that golden curtain, there were muffled cries from an exploited people. It was the kind of success that hides blood in its foundation, and it's striking how, even today, we continue to confuse prosperity with justice. The wealthy of Samaria slept peacefully in their luxurious beds, while their servants could barely rest. The nobles toasted with overflowing wine glasses, while the poor hardly had access to drinkable water. And the most alarming part? The religious worship was going strong, altars full, offerings abundant, but it was all a show, a rehearsed spectacle to hide the rottenness of a corrupt society. And Amos, with the eyes of someone who lives the reality of the fields, saw it all. It's easy to believe that blessing means comfort, but Amos learned early that sometimes comfort is just anesthesia, a way to numb a society that has abandoned justice. Samaria was intoxicated by its own image. Want a modern parallel? It's like someone showcasing a flawless feed on social media, but humiliating the delivery guy for being late. Appearance means nothing to God. He searches the heart, and the heart of that city was tainted. The contrast between what was shown and what was lived was brutal, and Amos didn't sugarcoat the message. He denounced houses built on exploitation, profits accumulated through lies, and the false sense of security supported by wealth. All of this while the simple people were crushed like wheat in the threshing floor. He wasn't fooled by facades. Those who walk with God learn to see beyond the world's makeup. In one of his speeches, Amos refers to the women of Samaria as cows of Bashan, not for gratuitous insult, but to reveal how inflated they were with luxury while trampling on the weak. Strong, right? But necessary, because prophecy is not flattery, it's diagnosis. And those who love the truth don't protect the oppressor just because they sing praises or hold an important title. Samaria symbolized faith without ethics, worship without repentance, devotion without love. What hurt God's heart the most wasn't just social injustice, it was the fact that it thrived in a people who claimed to represent him. That's even more dangerous, because when wickedness wears religious garments, it deceives even the well-intentioned. That's why Amos tore the veil. You live well at the expense of others' pain, and do you really think God is silent about this? It's the kind of message that pulls people out of their comfort zones. This part of Amos's mission is an urgent invitation to self-analysis. Where have we hidden our own injustices under the rug of religiosity? In which areas do we pretend to worship while ignoring those who suffer? Perhaps deep down, many of the structures we maintain today, in families, businesses, churches, are updated versions of ancient Samaria. And the most dangerous part is when we start believing that everything is fine, just because it all looks pretty. But Amos didn't go there to admire the architecture or flatter princes. He went to dismantle facades and reveal the rot that everyone preferred to keep hidden. And when truth starts echoing in the streets, the palaces, and even the altars, one thing is certain. Either it transforms, or it meets resistance. And it's precisely at this point that Amos turns his eyes and his words towards the house of Israel itself. When Amos finally turns his eyes toward Israel, the sword of truth doesn't hesitate. He begins by condemning the neighboring nations, and the people applaud. But suddenly the tone shifts. And you, Israel, think you're exempt from this? Silence. It was as if a mirror had been held up to the elite. Their practices were far from just. They bought the poor for a pair of sandals, crushed the humble, even bargained over the dust of the wheat. It was greed disguised as economy. Amos's accusation wasn't vague. He spoke of merchants who rigged scales, judges who sold verdicts, and the rich who hoarded land while the people could barely feed their children. He was direct, no sugarcoating, and this is what's still missing from many pulpits, the courage to name sin even when it's sitting in the front row of the church. Amos did this with such precision that no one could say, "This isn't about me." He also warned, all these mansions built won't bring any benefit. You'll live in them for only a short time. These vineyards planted with others' sweat will bring no joy. In other words, everything born from injustice has an expiration date. It's like poisoned fruit. It may seem sweet at first, but it destroys in the end. How many today live in this same deception, thinking that achievements without ethics will have a firm foundation? The prophet challenged complacency with an almost uncomfortable clarity. It was like someone shouting in a room full of people distracted by their own privileges. And let's be honest, when everything seems to be working, no one wants to hear that it's all wrong. But that's exactly where the prophetic voice comes in. Amos didn't come to please, he came to awaken, because before God restores, he exposes. Before he heals, he shows where the wound is. And that hurts. Today, we invent nice names to hide old horrors. We call exploitation opportunity, corruption a little workaround, greed entrepreneurial vision. Amos tore the varnish off these words and called them what they truly were: sin. He wasn't driven by hatred, but by zeal. He loved too much to remain silent in the face of lies, and that's rare, loving enough to confront. Because the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Imagine someone today stepping onto a stage at the stock exchange or before Congress and saying, "Everything here is rotten." That's exactly what Amos did in Israel. He went to the powerful and the religious and said, "God doesn't approve of any of this." He wasn't there to entertain audiences. He was there to shake structures. And when truth is proclaimed with courage, it does just that. It disturbs, it provokes, but it also frees those who have ears to hear. Amos didn't separate religious sin from social sin. To him, injustice in the marketplace was just as detestable as hypocrisy in the temple. And this needs to be understood. God doesn't just want hands raised in worship. He wants clean hands in daily life. A faith that doesn't affect ethics is a half-faith. He denounced a people who sang loudly but practiced evil in silence, who knew verses but ignored the neighbor on the sidewalk. And this call to awareness was just the beginning. Because what would come next wouldn't just be words, it would be visions. God would begin to show Amos through powerful images the judgment that would come if the people didn't listen. And as always, the prophet's voice would be there, firm, between the justice of heaven and the cry of the earth. After his sharp words, Amos begins to see, literally. God gives him visions, images full of weight, meaning, and fear. The first one is devastating, a locust plague about to destroy the newly sprouted crops, a harvest destroyed before it even ripens. The impact is immediate. Amos understands that this judgment means famine, collapse, and misery. And then, for the first time, he doesn't condemn. He intercedes. "Lord, forgive. How can Jacob stand, so small as he is?" This moment reveals something precious. The true prophet does not rejoice in punishment. He trembles before it. Amos, the firm and incisive man, now cries in prayer. He not only points out the wrong, he cries out for mercy. And this teaches us something fundamental. Justice and compassion do not oppose each other. They walk together. Those who denounce out of love also kneel for restoration. There is strength in taking a stand, but there's even more power when that stance comes from a broken heart. The second vision is of fire, a blaze consuming everything, even the deepest abysses, as if God's judgment were unstoppable and inevitable. Again, Amos stands in the gap. He doesn't try to justify God nor rationalize the judgment. He simply cries out, "Lord, please don't do this." This is true intercession. It's when someone feels the weight of judgment before it even falls. Today there are many who criticize, judge, and cancel, but few who intercede. The third vision is even more symbolic. God appears holding a plumb line, that tool that reveals whether a wall is straight. And he declares, "I will no longer pass by them." The plumb line reveals the deviation, and the message is direct. "I measured, and you are crooked." Have you thought about that? Being evaluated by God, not by appearance, but by the alignment of the heart with justice. And the worst part, the people were so accustomed to distortion that they thought it was normal. God's plumb line doesn't get fooled by decorations or speeches. It goes straight to the foundation, and if there's a crack, he exposes it. How many lives today are leaning toward convenience, built on lies, yet still apparently standing? Amos understood that God wasn't going to turn a blind eye anymore. The time for patience was over. And the scariest part, the people didn't even realize how misaligned they were. What stands out is that Amos didn't use these visions as political threats, nor as a tool for manipulation. He was a simple man, proclaiming deep truths with fear and clarity. He saw symbolic images, but interpreted them with moral awareness. And that's why his words have lasted through the centuries. They didn't come from religious marketing, but from someone who lived with his feet in the pain and his eyes on the sky. It's important to remember, Amos wasn't a professional of faith. He had no agenda, no planned prophetic career. When he interceded, it was genuine. When he spoke, it was out of conviction. And this raises a current question. Have we been paying attention to the visions of judgment that God is still communicating in the crises, the pains, the signs around us? Or are we so distracted by the surface that we don't even notice the wall is already falling? And it was precisely when these visions began to shake the religious structures that resistance emerged. Because nothing disturbs more than a man with no title, but full of truth. And at that moment the institutional system tries to silence Amos. But he doesn't stay silent. He wasn't raised to please, he was raised to confront. And that's when the clash with the priest Amaziah starts to take shape. The voice of Amos echoed too loudly to be ignored. His accusations no longer only bothered the rich, they now struck at the very core of institutional religion. And it's at this point that Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, emerges. A man of position, prestige, pulpit, and palace. He sends a message to the king and accuses Amos of conspiracy. But deep down, what bothered Amaziah the most wasn't the tone of the prophet's words. It was the fact that they revealed the complacency of his own system. Amaziah represents the type of leadership that prefers to maintain the appearance of order rather than deal with the truth. He doesn't confront the content of Amos's message. He just tries to banish him from the territory. In other words, go away, prophet, this isn't your place. And Amos responds with one of the most striking statements in Scripture. I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. I was a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees, but the Lord took me. What a response. A true lesson on identity and calling. This statement reveals something profound. Amos didn't depend on the system to exist. He wasn't there for a position, but for a mission. He wasn't seeking visibility. He carried urgency. And that made him dangerous to the status quo. Because someone who has nothing to lose cannot be controlled. It's always been this way. Corrupt systems fear prophets more than external enemies. The attempt to silence Amos reveals a pattern that repeats throughout history. When religion becomes complicit in injustice, it begins to fight against those who try to restore its essence. It's as if they say, preach faith but don't touch on power, preach heaven but don't get involved with the earth. But Amos came to make it clear. Faith that doesn't touch the ground doesn't reach the sky. And when spirituality disconnects from justice, it becomes a spectacle, beautiful on the outside, cold on the inside. Today, we see echoes of Amaziah in many places. People who protect structures instead of caring for people. Leaders who prefer to silence the truth in the name of a supposed unity. And the most troubling part, many claim to be defenders of God, when in practice they are only defending their own interests. Amos, on the other hand, had no one to please. He only wanted to be faithful to the God who took him from the pasture. And true faithfulness doesn't bow before positions or applause. This confrontation also teaches about courage. The courage to take a stand, even knowing it may mean loneliness. Amos didn't have crowds supporting him. He had conviction. Today, many seek to be relevant, but relevance without truth is just performance. Amos was relevant because he was authentic, and in a world full of masks, being real is a revolutionary act. He didn't need a temple to have authority. He carried the seal of heaven over his life. And notice this curious thing. Amaziah was the priest of Bethel, a center of worship full of rituals, but empty of God's presence. This teaches us that not every place with worship has God, and not every leader who uses God's name speaks for him. It's strong, yes, but necessary. Because if there's one thing Amos couldn't tolerate, it was the hypocrisy of an empty worship, where people sing with their lips what they deny with their actions. And it's in this tense atmosphere, between the boldness of the prophet and the resistance of the religious, that Amos opens his heart and with even greater clarity exposes what God truly desires, a worship that overflows in justice, a worship that translates into action, a faith that produces equity. Because in the end, the praise God accepts doesn't just come from the mouth, it is revealed in the hands that help, in the feet that walk with integrity, and in a life committed to good. There comes a point when Amos makes it clear. The problem wasn't the worship itself, but the fact that it was completely disconnected from life. It was a people who raised their hands in the temple, but crushed the poor at the market. They gave offerings with pomp, but corrupted the weight of the scales. And God, through the prophet, says something staggering. I hate your religious festivals. I cannot bear your solemn assemblies. Imagine hearing that. From God himself, a worship that provokes nausea in heaven. The accusation is direct. You sing, but you don't live what you sing. You play instruments, but the chords don't reach God's heart. Because God doesn't hear sound, he hears intention. He doesn't see the aesthetics of the altar. He sees the ethics of everyday life. And this is a direct blow to the idea that just going to church makes everything okay. Amos shatters this illusion with a phrase that became a symbol. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. This image is powerful. A river of justice, not a trickle of occasional moralism, but a living current that cleans, transforms, sweeps away the hidden filth. It's as if God is saying, I don't want just your songs. I want your life to sing what your mouth declares. And this still confronts us today. How many times do we confuse faith with liturgy, devotion with physical presence, religiosity with spirituality? Worship without practice is just acting. Amos calls us back to the essence. He wants visible, tangible justice. That reveals itself in how we treat the delivery person, the housekeeper, the cashier, the neighbor. A justice that shows in how we deal with the different, the fragile, the forgotten. If our spirituality doesn't change our actions, then it is stagnant. Want a real challenge? Take this week and practice an act of justice. Forgive someone, share a meal, listen to a stranger. The prophet also denounces daily frauds, vendors who cheat on weight, merchants who exploit prices, markets sustained by greed. And God sees this. Yes, he visits the market, the register, the contract. Amos shows that spirituality starts outside the temple. Ethics at work, honesty in traffic, integrity behind the scenes. All of this is also an altar. Life cannot be divided between the sacred and the secular when walking with God. He doesn't want hands raised if they are stained with oppression. He doesn't want tuned voices if they ignore the pain of others. Amos is clear. The problem wasn't singing, it was neglecting. And this should shake us, because it's possible to be moved in worship and still live far from God's heart. This is not a condemnation, it's a call to awareness, an invitation to the mirror of the soul where we stop performing and start living for real. And more, the prophet isn't content with just denouncing, he calls us to action. It's an urgent appeal. He says, it's not enough to stop doing wrong, start doing good. Justice isn't just the absence of oppression, it's the presence of equity. It's making sure there's a place for everyone at the table. It's raising your voice for those who have no voice. And this, my friend, is the kind of worship God never rejects, because he rejoices when worship transforms into action. Amos ends this passage with a sense of urgency. Either the people change or judgment will come. But even under pressure, there's a seed of hope. Because if God is still speaking, it's because he still desires to transform. And this hope begins to take shape when he reveals an unexpected plan, a promise of reconstruction that emerges after the confrontation. And those who pay attention notice, the end of the prophecy isn't destruction, it's a new beginning. After so much judgment, Amos's voice changes tone, not because he gave up denouncing, but because God's heart always leaves room for restoration. And then an unexpected and beautiful promise emerges. On that day I will raise up the fallen tent of David. A tent, not a palace, a symbol of simplicity, of ancient communion, of righteous reign. Amid so much ruin, God promises to rebuild something real, not based on opulence but on covenant. This image carries profound symbolism. The tent of David points to a restoration that is not just political, but spiritual. God isn't looking for grand structures. He desires surrendered hearts. The promise is not only of physical reconstruction, but of a return to the essence, a people guided by justice, led by truth, and blessed with peace. And this hope doesn't belong only to ancient Israel. It spans centuries and reaches our generation as well. The text speaks of a time when the plowman will overtake the reaper, a continuous abundance where the harvest seamlessly flows into the next. It's life flourishing without interruption. Prosperity that doesn't stem from exploitation but from blessing, a cycle sustained by grace. How many of us long for this? A time when work has purpose, fruit endures, and the land responds with joy. It's possible, but it depends on something essential: repentance. God promises to restore the captives, gather the scattered, and rebuild the ruined cities. It's as if he's saying, if you leave behind the lie, I'll return what was lost. It's a sacred exchange, and that invitation still stands. Some people live as if the mistake had the final say. But Amos reminds us, God is just, yes, but he is also merciful. He disciplines, but he also rebuilds. He knocks down, only to raise up better. This passage feels like a sigh, a soft breeze after the storm. It shows that the purpose of judgment was never the end, but the beginning again. And that God's hope is not an illusion, it's a plan that includes the forgotten, the broken, and those left on the margins. The prophet who started with a plow and sheep ends by talking about abundant harvests and restored cities. It's proof that God always writes the final chapter with ink of grace. And see how extraordinary this is. The same God who once declared, "I will no longer pass by you," now promises to dwell again among the people. This is reconciliation. Like a father who corrects his child but soon after calls him back home. Amos knew that this hope didn't arise from human merit, but from divine character. A father who, even wounded by disobedience, still reserves a place at the table. And that changes everything. The promise also includes the land being renewed, vines flourishing, cities being populated, families restored. In other words, true faith doesn't only transform the sky, it transforms the earth too. And this calls us to responsibility. It's no use waiting for tomorrow's blessing while we continue supporting injustice today. Hope must be cultivated with concrete actions. And so, Amos leaves the scene. There is no record of his death, no glorious ending, no crowd applauding. He simply fulfills his mission and disappears. But his message remains, echoing through the centuries in pulpits, in the streets, and perhaps in the hearts of those who hear it now. Because justice, when planted, continues to flow. And this river, which started with denunciation, now runs toward us, waiting to be kept alive by our choices. What's curious about Amos is that he simply disappears. There's no mention of his death, no triumphant ending. No crowds applauding his name, no statues in his honor. The prophet who shook the structures of the northern kingdom just falls silent. But his silence is louder than many empty shouts, because when someone speaks the truth, their voice continues to echo even after it's gone silent. It's the kind of legacy that doesn't need a microphone. It needs courage. Amos didn't found a prophetic school, nor did he create followers. He simply did what needed to be done, and returned to the fields. But his message crossed centuries, broke boundaries, and continues to shake consciences to this day. Why? Because he said what few have the courage to say. His legacy lives in the ears that are willing to listen and in the hands that decide to act. It's not an institutional inheritance, it's spiritual, a permanent call to integrity. It's important to understand that the most powerful legacy isn't measured by applause, but by impact. Amos shows that you don't need to be in the big cities or on famous pulpits to spark transformation. Sometimes the greatest revolution starts in a pasture, with a simple person saying, "Enough." And look, centuries later, the Apostle James cites Amos at the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15. This proves that what is true never gets lost. The strength of Amos's legacy also lies in his consistency. He didn't preach one thing and live another. He didn't speak of justice while negotiating privileges behind the scenes. He was a whole man, whole in faith, in positioning, in mission. That's rare. Today we see many strong on the stage but fragile in character. Amos was the opposite, unknown on the stages but unshakable inside. And the silence that followed his mission also communicates something. He didn't try to stay in the spotlight. He didn't become a guru, nor did he seek spiritual limelight. This teaches about detachment. Amos wasn't passionate about ministry. He was passionate about obedience. When he finished his part, he returned to anonymity, because the focus was never on him, it was on the message. And when the message matters more than the messenger, heaven rejoices. There's something beautiful in that. God uses people who don't seek fame, people who simply respond to the call and trust that the impact will come from where it needs to come. The world might forget the name, but heaven will never forget those who were faithful. And today, maybe no one will see your decisions, maybe you won't be applauded, but if you remain just, firm, and whole, you will be leaving a legacy that time can't erase. Amos's legacy also inspires a generation tired of empty speeches, people who want to see the gospel in practice, who desire a faith that transforms the city, work, relationships. People who know that a superficial religion needs to make way for spirituality that truly transforms. And this only happens when someone rises up, like Amos, and says, "Enough." Sometimes all God needs is one person with the courage to stand. Finally, the silence of Amos sets the stage for something even greater, the responsibility of those who heard. Because once the truth has been proclaimed, no one can pretend they didn't hear. The question now is, what will we do with this message? Because if it didn't die with him, it needs to live in us. And this is the perfect segue for what's to come, the invitation that transforms spectators into protagonists. The message of Amos was not written to be read as a historical curiosity. It's an appeal, a direct call, a shake to the soul of those with eyes to see and ears to hear. After denouncing the wrong, crying out for justice, and announcing hope, comes the most challenging moment, the response. Because knowing is one thing, living what you know is another. And Amos pushes us in this direction. Now that you've heard all of this, what are you going to do with this truth? The idea that true worship must translate into practice is not symbolic. It's concrete. It's real. It's daily. It's in the way we treat those who think differently, in the respect we show those who have less, in the honesty we maintain with those who can't call us out. Amos shows that true worship happens in the small choices of everyday life. And this is the invitation, that the river of justice doesn't remain bottled up in a sermon, but overflows into our homes, workplaces, streets, and lives. Faith that doesn't promote change becomes a landscape, beautiful but useless. And the Bible never called anyone to be a display case. It calls us to be a bridge between what God desires and what the world needs. Amos was that bridge. And now the question that echoes is, who will continue this work? Injustice didn't stay in the past. Luxury without consciousness, worship without essence, exploitation disguised as a system, they're still with us. And you can be part of the change. This is the kind of message that forces us to face the mirror, to ask serious questions. Have I been consistent with what I believe? Has my faith manifested in practical justice? Do my actions support or sabotage what I declare with my mouth? These questions aren't meant to condemn us, but to wake us up. And those who wake up act differently, with more purpose, with more zeal, with more empathy. That's exactly what God is looking for. And if you feel this weight, this unrest, it may be your calling, not to be a professional prophet, but to be a voice, to live with truth, to walk with integrity. Maybe you'll never stand on a pulpit, but you can transform the workplace. You can change the atmosphere in your home. You can defend those who have no defense. You can make a difference with one just choice, even when no one is looking. The action that Amos proposes is not grand in spectacle, but in integrity. It's being faithful in the simple things, correcting the scales in the market, listening without judgment, helping without expecting anything in return. These are small gestures, but with eternal weight. Justice, according to Amos, doesn't begin in laws. It begins in consciousness. And that consciousness awakens when we understand that spirituality isn't an escape from the world, it's a commitment to it. And that commitment can start now. Literally. You can look at your relationships and ask, where can I practice more justice? You can reconsider your consumption habits, the way you treat employees, your posture on social media. You can start small, just as Amos did, but with truth, because it's not the size of your platform that matters, it's the depth of your commitment. And so, the voice of Amos ends, but our responsibility begins. He did what needed to be done. Now it's up to us to keep the river flowing, because justice that stops flowing rots, and mercy that's not practiced becomes empty words. The invitation is out, and those who accept it don't just watch the world change, they participate in the change. Now that you've heard all of this, what will you do with this message? Will you keep living as if it's just another old story? Or will you let this truth, burning on Amos's lips, ignite your conscience too? Because the truth is clear. The world is still full of Samarias disguised as blessings. There are still people trading justice for comfort, faith for appearances, and silence for convenience. And the question that won't go away is, will you be just another spectator? Or will you become the protagonist of this transformation? The river of justice still flows, but it needs someone to make a path. Who will be that person in your home, in your workplace, in your street? Maybe God is calling you exactly as He called Amos, in the middle of routine, anonymity, and simplicity. And when He calls, it's not to make noise, it's to make a difference. So tell me, what can you change today? Who do you need to forgive? What act of justice is in your hands right now, waiting for the courage to come to life? If this message touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Live it. Remember, legacy isn't built with pretty words. It's built with consistent choices. And if you want to keep diving into stories like this, that awaken the conscience and challenge faith in practice, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell. Because here we don't just deliver information, we deliver transformation.